Hello everyone, and I'd officially like to welcome you to the Insidious Agenda podcast. Before we dive into Chapter 1, I wanted to play something for you all that will set the stage and give you an appreciation for the story I'm about to tell. The roughly 1 minute long audio clip you're about to hear comes from the climactic battle at the end of the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose. It's the clash between Tom Wilkinson's character, Father Richard Moore, and the demonic entities plaguing Jennifer Carpenter's Emily Rose. This movie was based on the true story in today's episode. This case, in my opinion, is the most horrific of all cases of demonic possession, and certainly one of the best documented. I have to warn you in advance, during this podcast you'll hear some of the actual recordings taken through the exorcism process. Please ensure your audio level is set to moderate and adjusted accordingly. Discretion is advised.
Tell me your name. He who commands you is he who orders you thrown down from the highest heaven into the depths of hell. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I now command you. Tell me your name. Hear, therefore, and fear, Satan, enemy of the faith. Give me your name, demon. Ancient serpents, depart from this servant of God. Tell me your 6 names. We are the ones who dwell within.
Approaching the subject of a supposed demonic possession sometimes bleeds into the realm of medical science. For a true believer, possession by a demon is horrific, with the only absolution being the 16th century Rituale Romanum, or it's more commonly known as the Roman ritual, the rite of exorcism. This weapon of the Catholic Church is sometimes the only means to expel a demon from its possessed host. For a skeptic, the rite might seem entirely unnecessary. They would believe, as most people normally do, that doctors and medical professionals would be able to diagnose patients based on medical conditions exhibited and their associated behaviors. The procedure of exorcism can sometimes cost the afflicted person their life, and it will often lead to 2 trials, that of the courtroom and that of the court of public opinion. For this was the case with Anneliese Michel, a young German girl who was diagnosed with psychosis and epilepsy, but suffered at the hands of something far more sinister. Her life was an absolute tragedy, and she eventually would pass away from malnourishment and dehydration after taking part in 67 exorcisms. The end of the exorcisms, unfortunately, wouldn't be the end of Anneliese's story. As for what truly afflicted her, that I'll leave for you to decide. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. I'm your host Nick, and on this week's episode, we're going to explore the events surrounding the possession and exorcism of Anneliese Michel, a young girl who was tormented by many demonic entities that would eventually cause her death. Ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. So, now it's time to turn out your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Maybe you're alone. Maybe you're not. Now, let my voice guide you as we travel back to the 1950s and the beginning of our story. Anna Elizabeth Michel was born in the small town of Liebelfling, West Germany, on the 21st of September 1952. Her parents were Joseph and Anna, and she had 3 sisters. Anneliese's family were devout Roman Catholics. She attended Mass twice a week. Her father, Joseph, had received training as a priest, and 3 of Anneliese's aunts were nuns. Before she was born, her family went through serious hardship. About 3 to 4 years before her birth, Anneliese's mother, Anna, would give birth to an illegitimate daughter named Martha. Because of this, her mother was forced to wear a black veil to her own wedding. Unfortunately, Martha would pass away at the age of 8 during an operation to remove a tumor from her kidney. During her childhood, Anneliese was encouraged by her mother to do penance for her sins. As a testament to her devotion, Anneliese would attempt to make reparations for the sins of wayward priests and drug addicts by doing such things as sleeping on a bare floor during the winter. She was coming into her faith at a time when some major changes were coming to the Catholic religion. The one that was most notable, that really struck a chord with her, was with the Holy Sacrament of Communion. The Church had adopted a new way of doing communion by issuing the body of Christ in hand. Her conviction against this was so strong that it led her to seek out another church that was administering it in a more traditional way. Her classmates would go on to describe Anneliese as withdrawn and very religious. In August of 1969, shortly before she turned 16, Anneliese inexplicably blacked out and began walking around in a daze. When she came to, she had absolutely no recollection of any of the events that had taken place. Her family and friends could only describe her as having been in a trance-like state. Her family would bring her to their family doctor, a man by the name Dr. Vogt, and her neurologist named Dr. Luthi for examination. After a brain scan, Dr. Luthi was unable to locate the cause of the episode, and it was determined that it was likely to be a temporal seizure. About a year following her first episode, Anneliese would awaken in another trance-like state in her bedroom. The episode was so severe, it caused her to wet the bed and begin convulsing, and she would shake uncontrollably. It was this second event that caused her family to seek out a neurologist at the Würzburg Psychiatric Clinic, where she would have a follow-on diagnosis of temporal lobe epilepsy. Her diagnosis was certainly one that could be believed, as it bared the symptoms of seizures, memory loss, and the experiencing of hallucinations. All were afflicting Anneliese. While under observation at the clinic, in June of 1970, she would experience a third episode that resulted in her being prescribed Dilantin, a powerful anti-seizure medication. It was after this second episode and diagnosis where Anneliese's case would take a darker turn. She started experiencing hallucinations where she would see what she described as devil faces at all hours of the day and night. Anneliese would not let these episodes hold her back from living a normal life, and like most kids her age, she went on to attend university. Unfortunately, while here, she would suffer her third seizure. A few of Anneliese's school friends came by her one day praying the rosary, which to them was not uncharacteristic for her. It was then they noticed that her hands were contorted, similar to the shape of a cat's paws, and her pupils were dilated to the point they appeared entirely black. Another time, while also praying the rosary, she claimed to have witnessed a menacing face appear before her. It was at this point she would swear off praying the rosary for fear that it may return. Later that year, Anneliese would experience other peculiar things that she did not report to her doctors. She experienced stiffness in her limbs and joints more frequently, and she began smelling a horrible smell that others could not. The stiffness was a known side effect of the drug she was prescribed, but it was never known to cause hallucinations. None of this would deter Anneliese from living the good Catholic life that she knew she could live. She would continue her religious observance. She hung pictures of Catholic saints on her walls and kept a bottle of holy water near her door. And even though she swore it off before, she did continue to pray the rosary. By the year 1973, Anneliese was growing increasingly frustrated with her doctors, being unable to manage her symptoms as, by this point, she had been prescribed many different medications over the past 5 years. She began to cast off the medical community for having been unable to find a cure for her over the many years of treatment. They would next prescribe her the drug Tegretol, an anti-epileptic, which she would take frequently for the rest of her life. Unfortunately for Anneliese, the only one thing that her medications couldn't do was stop her from seeing hallucinations. She began seeing the face of the devil everywhere, and she grew increasingly tormented by voices in her head telling her that she would be damned for all of eternity. She had begun to accept the belief that it must be the devil himself possessing her. She began seeking religious assistance to rid her of this possessed state. In 1975, at the age of 23, she would accompany her friends and some of her family on a trip to San Damiano, a church near Assisi in northern Italy. This was an important religious site for the Christian and Catholic faith, where St. Francis is said to have heard the voice of Christ in the year 1205. While visiting San Damiano, it would be reported by a few of the people that accompanied Anneliese that she started to be unable to tolerate Catholic objects. She was unable to walk past crucifixes and refused to drink the water of a holy spring. The following is an account of Anneliese's time at San Damiano, and was recorded in the words of Father Alt as the following. Anneliese told me, and Frau Hein confirmed this, that she was unable to enter the shrine. She approached it with the greatest hesitation, then said the soil burned like fire and she simply could not stand it. She then walked around the shrine in a wide arc and tried to approach it from the rear. She looked at the people who were kneeling in the area surrounding the little garden, and it seemed to her that while praying they were gnashing their teeth. She got as far as the edge of the little garden, and then she had to turn back. Coming from the front again, she had to avert her glance from the picture of Christ. She made it several times to the garden but could not get past it. She also noticed that she could no longer look at medals or pictures of saints. They sparkled so immensely that she could not stand it. It was after this trip that Frau Hein, who was an elderly woman that accompanied Anneliese, would suggest to her that she was truly the victim of demonic possession. Anneliese conversed with Frau Hein in a deep voice and began behaving very inappropriately. Frau Hein would also make note that Anneliese had a certain smell about her, akin to the smell of feces or something burning. This was also corroborated by other members who took part in the trip. Owing to her current symptoms and the doctors not being able to remedy her ailment, she had begun to accept that she was possibly truly possessed. This caused her to move away from the advice of her doctors and seek solace within the Catholic Church. Anneliese, along with her family, would consult several priests about her condition and eventually would begin to beg for an exorcism. The priests, with whom her family would originally meet, would decline the family's request and recommend the continuation of her medical treatments. They would also inform the family they would be unable to carry out the rite of exorcism without the explicit consent of their bishop. On the 3rd of September, 1973, the family would again visit Dr. Luthi. Anneliese told him of the faces that were plaguing her, and it's here that the story diverges. Anneliese Michel has stated that Dr. Luthi informed her to contact a Jesuit to rid her of these faces, but the doctor himself has denied ever doing so. Dr. Luthi didn't think much of the symptoms that Anneliese was describing and prescribed her the drug Epilepsy, a drug normally given to combat neurosis. After this, Anneliese would never go back to Dr. Luthi. Due to his dismissiveness of her symptoms, Anneliese would never mention them to any other doctor. Frau Hein, the same woman who had taken the trip to San Damiano with Anneliese earlier in her life, had reached out to an elderly Jesuit priest, a man by the name of Father Adolf Rodewijk, in Frankfurt. Father Rodovic was an expert in the field of demonic possession, but was unable to travel to meet Anneliese, and recommended Father Hermann from the Mother of God parish in Aschaffenburg. Father Hermann would bring Anneliese to his home for visits on 10 separate occasions. He found her to have a friendly demeanor, and she was a nice, deeply religious girl. He made the recommendations to her that she see a neurologist, which she informed him she already had. Father Hermann made note that he did not notice any sacrilegious behavior from her, and she was able to pray the rosary with him many times without incident. In September of 1973, Father Hermann would visit Father Ernst Alt at a neighboring parish. Father Alt was all too familiar with Anneliese's case, having been told about it previously by Frau Hein. He was not as experienced as Father Hermann, but had a genuine interest in the paranormal and had been educated about extrasensory perception. Father Alt's fascination with ESP came from a personally held belief that he had powers of telepathy and foresight. After meeting with Father Hermann, Father Alt would perform Mass that evening on Anneliese's behalf. Though he had never met her, he believed it would be of great benefit to her. While preparing for the consecration, Father Alt began experiencing strange feelings. In his words, he described these as, "All of a sudden, something hit me in the back. The air turned cold, and at the same time, there was an intense stench, as though something were burning. I had to lean against the altar. With great effort, and only by considerable concentration, was I able to speak the rest of the text. I felt deeply distressed, as if a negative force itself were surrounding me, which, however, aside from vexing me, could cause no real harm." Following the Mass, Father Alt would return to his quarters, but was unable to sleep. He was being afflicted by some of the same symptoms that plagued Anneliese, the smell of burning and a horrid stench. He also had issues with his vision. It's still unknown how Father Alt was experiencing some of the same things that plagued Anneliese. It wouldn't be until after suffering through this that Father Alt would learn about the specifics of Anneliese's symptoms from Father Roth. Weeks later, Father Alt and Anneliese would meet for the first time. At their first meeting, he took note of how sickly she appeared. With Father Alt, she never stated that she was possessed, and it was his understanding that she didn't entirely understand what demonic possession was. After the first meeting, he knew that proving her case of demonic possession would take a long time. In the fall of 1973, she returned to school. She made note of lacking energy throughout the day and felt as though she lacked the willpower to complete the easiest of tasks. She began seeing a Freudian psychiatrist named Dr. Lenner, who believed that her condition was brought on by her father's failure to understand and a deep-seated hatred for her mother. At times, Anneliese began to feel like she had lost control of her motor function, and it was though, as she described, someone else were giving the orders. In 1974, she saw Father Alt less frequently, but he did continue to encourage her to keep seeing her doctors. By March, she was becoming socially distant, with no reprieve coming from her medications. She had begun losing the ability to pray, save for the times that she would visit Father Alt. She would write a letter to Father Alt, outlining that she was losing confidence in herself, and reiterated that it felt as though she were losing control of her own actions. Father Alt would then bless Anneliese, and noticed that after about 20 minutes, her condition began to improve. Through the fall of 1974, she would attempt to become more engaged in religious events, and even attempted to get her driver's license. For a time, she would even be able to see her friends again. She would see one of her doctors in June, and her condition seemed promising. Unfortunately, this period of renaissance wouldn't last. Her depression set in again, and she was unable to continue her studies or see her friends. She had again grown an aversion to religious objects and became unable to walk without supporting herself on furniture. On occasion, her face would also contort itself into a demonic visage. Father Alt would visit her again in July and begun to pray over her. She would erupt into terrible fits. Father Alt had mentioned that during the prayer he could feel a coldness radiating from Anneliese's body. In his mind, he began reciting the initial prayer of exorcism. When this happened, Anneliese became aggravated. She jumped up and destroyed her rosary. As her condition worsened, she began to exhibit behaviors that were inhuman. She would tear the clothes from her body. She would compulsively perform 400 squats a day, mainly due to prayer. During one episode, she crawled under a table in her family home and barked like a dog for 2 days straight. She had a strange habit of routinely eating spiders and coal. She bit the head off a dead bird, and during the time she wasn't able to make it to the bathroom, she would even lick her own urine off the floor. Even though under heavy doses of antipsychotic medication, she would begin to become more aggressive, even to the point of injuring herself. The hallucinations would worsen, and she began seeing the demons everywhere. She would continue her descent into the possessive state, beginning to growl and throw objects. She had begun seeing clouds of flies and different manners of shadow creatures. Anneliese had begun to see deceased persons, and even stigmata began appearing on her body. Because of this, the Michels were able to convince Father Rodovic to visit with Anneliese. When he arrived, he saw her lying on the floor in a trance-like state, completely oblivious that a Jesuit had come into her room. Her family was able to move her to the sofa, and Father Rodovic asked her what her name was, to which she replied, Judas, in a voice that was not her own. Because of this, Father Rodovic confirmed that this truly was a case of demonic possession. With the convincing reports received from Father Rodovic and Father Alt, Bishop Joseph Stangl authorized the exorcism on the 16th of September, 1975. Initially reluctant, the bishop would relent and grant permission to a local priest, Father Arnold Rentz, a pious man with exemplary intelligence, to carry out the exorcisms with the explicit direction that they be carried out in secret. Now, let's take a step back for a moment and examine what is required for the Catholic Church to authorize an exorcism. By definition, exorcism is a specific form of prayer that the Church uses against the power of the devil. Why are exorcisms truly needed? There are instances when a person needs to be protected against the power of the devil, or to be withdrawn from his dominion. At such times, the Church has to invoke the power and the name of Jesus Christ for this protection and liberation through the rite of exorcism. There are two types of exorcisms. Simple exorcisms usually take place before baptism and normally only involve the saying of a series of prayers. The second is a major exorcism and may only be carried out by a bishop or a priest specially trained, normally through apprenticeship, and appointed by their administration. For what it takes for the Catholic Church to authorize an exorcism, we'll examine the Vatican's guidelines from 1999. Yes, this is well after the exorcism of Anneliese, but that case directly influenced these. It's a good measuring stick document to see how the Church viewed the authorization of exorcism in 1999 versus what Anneliese experienced in the 1970s. The person who claims to be possessed must be evaluated by doctors to rule out physical or mental illness. More often than not, exorcisms are not required due to the person requiring spiritual or medical help, especially if addiction has presented itself. The signs of demonic possession are inclusive of, but not limited to, the following: loss of appetite, cutting, scratching or biting of skin, a cold feeling in the room, unnatural bodily postures, losing control of personality and entering into a frenzy or rage, a change in voice, supernatural physical strength, speaking in tongues a person could not possibly have known, knowledge of past events a person wouldn't have known about, levitation and moving of objects, expelling of objects, intense hatred, aversion, and violent reactions to religious items, antipathy towards entering a church or hearing Christ's name or the reading of Scripture. So, back to Anneliese's story. With the authorization of the exorcism, the plan to drive the demons from the body of Anneliese Michel was set in motion. The demons plaguing her would be set to do battle with Fathers Alt and Father Renz. The first exorcism was held on the 24th of September 1975. When he arrived on the first day, Father Renz made note of Anneliese's tranquility. However, once they began administering the rite, she immediately began to convulse. Screaming and writhing, she had to be held down by 3 men. She would then be sprinkled with holy water, which only brought more screaming and obscene language directed at the priests. The first exorcism lasted 5.5 hours, and when Anneliese came to at the end, she believed they should have continued. In future exorcisms, Father Renz would experiment with different methods during the exorcism. At one point, he ordered, in Latin, ut discedas ab famula de Anneliese, which translates as, "May you depart from this handmaid of God." The only reply he received from within was, "No, she belongs to me." On another occasion, he would fill 5 bottles of holy water, with only one being just that. Anneliese, when sprinkled with it, knew exactly which of the identical bottles the holy water was. The demons themselves would resent any invocation of their arch nemesis, Saint Michael the Archangel, or the Virgin Mary. Into October, the demonic entities weakened and began to lash out less frequently. At this time, Anneliese also began receiving messages from who she believed was the Virgin Mary. Mary asked Anneliese if she was prepared to suffer in penance for other German youth and priests. Owing to her devoutness, she agreed. Anneliese was told that her suffering had come in the form of demonic possession. She was set to be what was known as a victim soul. The purpose in her suffering was that she would show Germany, and moreover the entire world, that devils do really exist. She had also begun to receive messages from a spirit known only to her as the Savior. The spirit would ask Anneliese to be patient, and things to the effect of, "I will give you my grace. You will be true unto death." The exorcisms would continue through the winter. At one point, Anneliese informed Father Renz that she had received divine compulsions that wouldn't allow her to eat or cover herself from the cold. She had begun feeling distant, and that her prayers were no longer being answered. She had a brief respite from her torment in March, but in April the demons returned again. On the night of April 13th, she felt the need to remain in her school's chapel until the morning. She experienced much torment over the Easter weekend, and by the end of the month had slipped back into the control of the entities within her. In the exorcisms through May, Father Renz noted that no demonic entities responded to him, although Anneliese would continue her convulsions. In June, she began making unnatural vocalizations, which Father Renz believed were for her penance, although he couldn't understand why. The exorcisms took place over the course of 10 months. The priests and Anneliese would take part in 1 or 2 exorcisms per week, usually in about 4 hours in duration each time. By the time that they had finally finished, she had been subject to 67 exorcisms total. One of the most frightening of all the things discovered during the exorcisms was that Anneliese's body was believed to have been plagued by not 1, but 6 demons. The priests were able to get the demons to reveal their names. The first was Cain, the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, who murdered his brother Abel, and is considered to be the originator of all evil. The second was Nero, the tyrannical, self-indulgent Roman emperor who committed suicide at 30 years old in the year 68. The third was that of Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Christ. The fourth demon was that of Father Valentin Fleischmann, a Frankish priest who was excommunicated from the church and accused of assault and murder. The fifth was Adolf Hitler, the wicked ruler of the German Third Reich who cost millions of people their lives. The final entity, and the most wicked and cruel, was Lucifer, the Prince of Darkness. These spirits, all within Anneliese, would struggle for control of her, and would communicate their presence through low growls emanating from Anneliese. Among other entities believed to have been named include Legion, a symbolism of Legion of Demon Hell, and Belial, one of Lucifer's chief lieutenants in Hell. Like they would do battle with the priests, the demons would also do battle with one another. Hitler at one point came forward to provide the following: "People are stupid as pigs. They think it's all over after death, but it goes on." Judas would accuse Hitler of having a big mouth and no real say in the hierarchy of hell. Through the exorcism process, Anneliese would hold true to her task, frequently stating that her death would atone for the sins of the youth and apostate priests. Her body suffered so much damage in the process. She broke the bones in her knees and ripped the tendons from the over 600 times she would drop to her knees each exorcism. To give you an idea of what Anneliese went through in terms of exorcism and torture from the spirits, I'm about to play actual recorded audio during these events. First, I'll play a copy of Anneliese's normal voice, unencumbered by that of demonic possession.
Ja, ich will auch für die anderen leiden, damit die nicht in die Hölle kommen und so. Aber dass das dann so schlimm ist und so grausam und so furchtbar, nee. Das denkt man leiden, das ist so leicht Sache, aber wenn es dann wirklich schlimm wird, da will man überhaupt nicht mehr, da will mein Kind.
Now, we'll play the recording of the demon that presented itself, that came forward as Lucifer. The exorcism held on the 30th of June, 1976, would be the final exorcism before her death. Anneliese was too weak and emaciated to perform prayers on her own. Thus, her parents were forced to help her through the motions required. Before the exorcism, her temperature measured at 38.9 degrees Celsius. Anneliese's last words ever spoken were to her mother, telling her that she was very afraid. At the conclusion of the exorcism, Father Rentz departed the home. Anna went to bed shortly after, while her father remained with Anneliese in her room. Anneliese had begun screaming and convulsing when her father would deal a final blow to their demons. Joseph had stated that he told the demons to depart in the name of God so that his daughter would recover. Anneliese immediately turned over and went to sleep. At 8 o'clock in the morning, on the 1st of July, 1976, Anneliese Michel was found dead in her room at the age of 23 years old. The results of her autopsy state that the cause of her death was severe dehydration and malnourishment. Other complicating factors were that, at the time of her death, she was only 68 pounds and suffered from pneumonia and a high fever. She would be buried next to her sister, Martha, in a cemetery normally reserved for illegitimate children. Her death, however, would not be the end of the story. The story grabbed national attention, so much so that an investigation was conducted which led to legal action against the two priests and even Anneliese's mother and father. In 1976, Fathers Alt and Rentz were charged with negligent homicide in the death of Anneliese Michel. Anneliese's parents, Joseph and Anna, were also brought up on the same charges. The Michel family was defended by Erich Schmidt-Leichner, while the priest's defense was sponsored by the church. The recommendation of the state was that none of the parties be given a sentence of jail time. The priests should only have to pay a fine, and the Michel's sentence amounting to time served, as they had already suffered enough through this ordeal. The proceedings of the trial, now known as the Klingenberg case, began on the 30th of March 1978 and were a key focal point in the national interest. The doctors who had treated Anneliese were among those to testify, stating that her condition was the result of a strict religious upbringing, which eventually caused her epileptic seizures. One of the doctors who attended Anneliese, Dr. Richard Roth, would testify to having told her that there is no injection against the devil. The defense, in their case, argued that the exorcism was legal and that the nation's constitution protected its citizens from restrictions to their beliefs. They played recordings, like you heard, taken during the exorcisms, even playing those which displayed the arguing of demons in order to prove that she was genuinely possessed. Holding true to their success with the exorcisms, the priests believed that Anneliese's soul was freed because of the last exorcism just before her death. When Anneliese's psychiatrist testified, they spoke about a concept known as doctrinaire induction. This was their explanation for Anneliese accepting the church's diagnosis of demonic possession due to the exorcists introducing that idea to her, and each exorcism enforcing that belief. Whether it be by the idea of doctrinaire induction or not, Anneliese and her caregivers were convinced that any potential medical treatment such as electric shock therapy, force feeding, or even having her medicated would have been against her will. Once completed, her autopsy would reveal that her brain was completely healthy and showed no evidence or symptoms that would have caused her seizures. Some of the key side effects of the medication she was prescribed were the onset of depression and suicidal thoughts. The prosecution, on behalf of the medical community, would state that had she been force-fed even up to a week before her death, that her death could have ultimately been prevented. Father Alt's state of mind was also called into question during the trial. They believed that he had an abnormal personality. Parts of his past likely exhibited symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. Although he himself showed no symptoms, doctors still declared that Father Alt suffered from schizophrenia. From this, it can be inferred that Father Alt was either suffering from schizophrenic delusion or his belief that Anneliese was suffering from demonic possession was correct. His counterpart, Father Rentz, was also determined to be of sound mind and good health. When asked about the exorcism, Bishop Stangl stated that he was not aware that Anneliese's condition had deteriorated as far as it had. He did not testify during the court proceedings. With the court case wrapped up, the jury decided that the priests and the family were guilty of negligent homicide or manslaughter. As a punishment, the judge handed out 6-month sentences to each of the defendants, which was immediately suspended. In addition to this, the defendants were ordered to share the costs of the court proceedings. Later review of the sentences would determine that they were stiffer than those requested by the prosecutor. The church also came under public scrutiny for its approval of such an archaic and ritualistic procedure, when the case was truly a misidentification of mental illness. Following the trial, the Michel family asked permission from the local authorities to exhume the remains of Anneliese, owing to the fact that she was buried with unnecessary haste and in a cheap coffin. Though this was the reason given to the authorities, her parents were acting on a message received from a nun who had contacted them from southern Bavaria. This nun had a vision that Anneliese's body was still intact. Permission would be granted to the Michel family almost 2 years after the initial burial. On the 25th of February 1978, Anneliese's body was exhumed. Anneliese's remains were placed in an oak coffin that was lined with tin. Even though in the decomposing process, official reports would state that her body still showed many signs of consistent deterioration. Even though they had gotten the approval for the body to be exhumed, Father Alt, Father Rentz, and even Anneliese's parents were not granted permission to be present during the exhumation or transfer of the remains. No photographs were ever taken of the exhumed body to confirm the nun's vision. To this day, Anneliese's gravesite in Klingenberg am Main has become a special place in the paranormal community and is a pilgrimage site to all who know her story. To their death, her parents could never visit her gravesite in person, but were able to look at it every day as it was visible from the window of their home. As a result of Anneliese's possession and subsequent attraction drawn by the court case, the church tightened the reins on the authorization of exorcism. Different fields of preference began to emerge among the popes. Pope Benedict XVI was largely in favor of a heavier use of exorcisms, while in contrast, Pope John Paul II was not, even going so far as to further tighten the rules regarding the rite in 1999. John Paul II limited exorcisms to only being done in the rarest of cases. In 1984, bishops from around Germany petitioned the Vatican to change the wording in the rite of exorcism. It was their belief that speaking directly to the devil or other inhabitant spirits, as outlined in the text, "I command thee, unclean spirit," only confirms to the afflicted person that they are without a doubt possessed. Another change brought about by the Vatican was the requirement for every priest performing exorcisms to undergo mandatory medical training. Over time, many new theories as to Anneliese's condition would present themselves. Many psychiatrists have speculated that Anneliese might have actually suffered from dissociative identity disorder, or more commonly, multiple personality disorder, and lacked control of movements. The rigidity of certain body postures, dilated pupils, the first-person descriptions of oneself, and of course, the emergence of multiple personalities may lead to a belief in demonic possession to explain the symptoms. The other cause of her condition remains similar to that of her first diagnosis, and would eventually support schizophrenia. The release of 2005's The Exorcism of Emily Rose brought the case back into the public eye. Up until her death, Anneliese's mother, Anna, refused to take part in the building of the film or providing any testimony regarding the exorcisms. She held firm, to her dying breath, that God told her to exorcise her daughter's demons. The story of Anneliese Michel is one that, in its truest form, can come down to religion versus science. Doctors, from the very onset of Anneliese's issues, were able to provide medical opinion and medication to counteract some of the symptoms, but were fighting an uphill battle, and, on occasion, losing it. Could Anneliese have truly been afflicted with an advanced case of psychosis, schizophrenia, or multiple personality disorder? It is likely, although, with her strict and varied treatment approach by medical professionals, she was unable to be remedied. Religion played a central figure in Anneliese's life from the time she was very young. It was imposed upon her by her parents, specifically her mother, and became entrenched in her life. In the beginning, she did not suspect the answer could be a religious one, but eventually began to accept the diagnosis of demonic possession after further engaging with her faith. Come in full circle, the clash of religion and science was put to the test in the courtroom, where it was ultimately determined that she had suffered death from negligence at the hands of her parents and the priests. One factor certainly remains in this story, is the freedom of choice between a person's wishes and doing what must be done to preserve life. Certainly, much like the jury decided that the medical diagnosis was sufficient in order to convict the priests and the Michels, scientific fact had prevailed that day in the courtroom. But certainly with this, one fact truly remains. With all the years knowledge and technology that they had, the medical community was unable to remedy whatever illness Anneliese Michel had suffered from. I won't make up my mind for you, but in the words of Aaron Bruner from The Exorcism of Emily Rose, facts leave no room for possibilities. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of our story and survived the retelling of The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the story. It's certainly my favorite. For more information, visit our Linktree and follow our social media accounts. If you can, I'd love you to leave a review or a post on our socials letting me know what you thought of this episode. Please ensure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss out on any of the new episodes to come. A new chapter will be released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please join us next week in exploring the story of Esther Cox and what's come to be known as the Great Amherst Mystery. Until then, we'll close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.